Hey guys, kia ora. My name's Chris Clancy. I am talking to you guys from New Zealand. I was an AP Euro teacher in the States until a couple months ago when I moved. And so I'm going to be taking you guys through this journey of Italian Renaissance art. So I hope everyone is doing well. Let's just jump right in. So, Italian Renaissance art is more than what you would say people think of when they think of the Renaissance. We oftentimes just think of this time period in Italy. We don't really think about it outside of Italy. When in reality, there are distinct differences to the Renaissance art that develops in this time frame. So today we're really only going to be focusing on the big one, which is Italy. And then next week, we're going to look at the Northern Renaissance, which will be in England, France, and Northern Europe. So remember to follow Think Fiveable on Twitter and Instagram, as well as on YouTube. Tell all your friends. The whole goal of Think Fiveable is to help you guys make a 5 and do really well on these AP exams. So the more the word is spread out, the better people can do. We do have a couple of upcoming streams specifically for AP Euro. On Tuesday at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time will be the Italian Renaissance, where Stephen Kuklik will be going over more of the nitty-gritty about daily life, about the specific people involved, as well as why the Renaissance actually happened. And then Friday, September 13th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Central Standard Time, we will be doing the Northern Renaissance, why it differed from the Italian Renaissance, where it spread to first, how it affected Northern Europe. And then Saturday at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, we'll be doing the Northern Renaissance art and how it differed from the Italian Renaissance art. So today, specifically, we're going to look at what medieval art is, because to understand why we make such a big deal of Renaissance art, we have to compare it to medieval art. And then we're going to look at what are the qualities of Renaissance art. What separates it from that medieval art? And we usually define those into 3 categories: humanism, individualism, and secularism. And we'll go over what those are, and I'll give you some examples through the art of how you can see that. We're going to talk about the masters. So if you know your turtles, you should know the masters: Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, and Michelangelo. And then we're going to talk about major patrons, why a patron would want to pay somebody to make art, what the power involved in is making art. Look specifically at the Medici family, and the Catholic Church. So without further ado, let us keep going. So, medieval art. If you look here on the left, you'll see this is a painting from the medieval time period showing the pulling down of Christ from the cross. And medieval art typically was almost always religious. If it was not religious in nature, it was depicting a battle from a war. And sometimes they would mix the two. You often would see battles have a religious nature, that God was on the side of the victors, the devil was leading the losers, things like that. If you look really close at the faces, they're all the same. You can't tell the difference. You can't tell male or female. You can't tell young and old. They're very flat, meaning they don't show emotion. There's no defining depth to them. So noses, like you would see on Renaissance art, they all look identical. And then you have the problem with the disproportionate bodies. If you look down here on the lower left, you see the guy, forgive me, I don't know who it is, pulling out the nails from Christ's feet. He looks really tiny. But why is he so tiny? He should look the same size as the other men that are around, because he's a full-grown man. Okay, and then you have the man holding Jesus, who he looks like he is almost the exact same size. Now, not that it's not possible, but with the lack of seeing a body there, it makes it look like they're almost together as one, and it's really hard to tell that there's somebody holding somebody else. In this picture, you can't really see it, but there is almost no perspective in medieval art, meaning you can't see depth, you can't see any kind of foreground or background. You have no way of knowing what is a close-up building or faraway animal, things like that. So medieval art, for all its downfalls, did have one really good thing going for it that I really like, and that was their manuscripts. Okay, because the medieval manuscripts, If you just Google them, they are some of the most beautiful books that you will ever see because they were all handmade. Okay. They were all drawn by hand, written by hand. Oftentimes, the sides of the books were stylized to depict whatever was going on. And so that, to me, is the big part of medieval art that I can say that they did really well, in my opinion. You can go to certain libraries and see some of these handwritten books. If you ever go to Ireland, you have the Book of Kells, some of the Gutenberg Bibles. While they were printed with the printing press, they went back and embossed them on the sides using that art style. So medieval art, it didn't just die. We sort of focus in on now looking at the manuscripts more than anything else. Renaissance art, on the other hand, is where we start to see the development of more what you would call modern art characteristics. Okay, Renaissance art, because it is so focused on those three ideals of humanism, secularism, and individualism, it often focused on an individual. You've got Da Vinci's painting down here of the Last Supper. There are 13 people in that painting, but your eye is immediately drawn to the center. Okay, and that is Christ. That is the focus of this painting. Okay, you have a foreground where you have the men at the table in the front, and in the background, you can see the wall of the building looks further away. You have the depth perception on the doors on the right and the windows in the back. So for Renaissance art, this was really new because this was not something that had been done before. They were effectively creating the first 3D pictures that weren't sculptures. And so for those of people that had never seen it before, it could be a little disconcerting because of how real it was. Because one of the things that Renaissance art was supposed to highlight was the perfection of the human form. Okay, and so they really highlighted facial features, they highlighted muscle tone or the lack thereof, and things like that. The big thing they use is proportionality in the body. And they also use this Italian term known as contrapposto or counterpose. So if you take the body and you cut it in half the body could be posed with like an arm bent and a leg bent, and the other half is posed with the arm straight and the leg straight. And it's supposed to give the sense of movement to a painting or to a sculpture. Medieval art didn't do that at all. Medieval art was flat and it was 2D and it didn't give any sense of movement. You can again look at the one on the left with the man pulling the nails out of Christ's foot. In a Renaissance painting, you would almost be able to see it happening live, even though obviously it wasn't. But in medieval art, because it's so flat, you can't have that imagination come to life for you. So here's some examples of medieval and Renaissance art. If you look here at the top, this is what I'm talking about with faces. Okay, the faces on both sides. You've got a couple here and there, but they're repeated multiple times over and over again. The same on the horses. The horses' faces are repeated. The eyes are the exact same on every horse. The size of the men, they're made to look absolutely huge, which means that the horses would either have to be bigger or made look smaller so the men looked bigger. And we just know that's not how perspective works. We also know that in the background here, this black spot you see in this painting, that's supposed to represent more troops keep going on and on and on. But we can't see that. It just looks like coloring in with a pen to me. On the right-hand side, you've got a church painting. You've got the nuns and the monks. They all look identical. All the nuns have the same face, have the same hair. All the monks have the same hair, same face. The only real difference is the color of their clothing. And even then, it's a repeated motif. That one of the things we do see come out of medieval art is a use of florals and geometric patterns. Often we associate that with more Eastern art or Islamic art, but it was used in Christian medieval art as well. You can see that on the side here. You look down here on this painting of this woman, and you can see a lot of high detail. You can see the braid in her hair, the different shades of the parrot's beak from that bright towards the face with the white shining on it, towards the darker black at the tip, the colors fading in as they go down into their respective patterns, the folds of the clothing. If you look up at these women up here, the folds of their clothing look more stagnant and not natural. They're not really how clothing or cloth would fit on a body. And then we also have probably one of the most famous Renaissance paintings over here, which is the School of Athens, that really gives us that depth perspective, with your eye going straight to the middle of Socrates and Plato, and you have the building continuing going on. All of these faces are individual faces. None of them are repeated. They all were to represent one of the great thinkers of the ancient Greek and Roman time. And if you look above it, all the faces are the same. So that's the big thing from Renaissance art that I think is the big takeaway, at least for me, is that you see that individuality coming in more than at any other time. Without that development, art as we know it today might have taken a completely different turn. And the Renaissance really kind of solidifies the beginnings of our viewpoint of us as an individual rather than a collective, rather than how we fit in within a greater society. So those three things that we look at with Renaissance art: humanism. Humanism, it can be defined in a lot of ways. It's the base word for the humanities. It's, focusing on us as ourselves. How do we make ourselves the best that we can be? How do we make others make themselves the best that they can be? With that, you can kind of sub-break it down into the other two, which is often what I do. You kind of have individualism within humanism. If we're focusing on human potential, that means we're focusing on the individual. How do we get that individual to reach the best achievements, the greatest heights that they can? And then most importantly is secularism. Now, here is the thing about secularism. This doesn't mean modern secularism. People in the Renaissance time period went to church every Sunday, Wednesday, and Saturday. You did not skip church. You did not all of a sudden go, I don't believe in God, or I don't go other than Christmas and Easter. You went to church because that's what everybody else did. But in your daily life, in your interactions with others, it wasn't always centered around the church any longer. That's what we mean by secularism. The accumulation of wealth is allowed now. The idea that you can have your own opinion rather than following the opinion of the church or of the king or the queen, whoever's in charge, was allowed. Secularism, I cannot stress enough here, it doesn't mean no God. They still were very religious in this time period, and they still went to church and held those beliefs very strongly. They just also happened to have very worldly beliefs as well. So they kind of lived in these two worlds back and forth. Depending on where you were doing that day, you lived in the church world or you lived in the secular world. And they had no problems with this. They felt it was perfectly fine. And it made sense for them. If you had survived the Black Death and you had seen a third of the population of the entire continent die, you probably get a little, oh, I don't care anymore and I'm going to do what I want. And that's okay. But on the other hand, you're also probably going to be like, but I don't want to push it too hard because what if I get punished like they did? So they did have this dichotomy back and forth, and they felt nothing wrong with it. So we're going to look at these four Italian masters. Leonardo da Vinci, probably the most famous of all Renaissance painters in history. He is what we call the Renaissance man. This is a polymorph, somebody who can do everything, basically. He was a painter, he was a sculptor, he was a scientist, he was a linguist, he was a mathematician, he inventor, he was an anatomist, he began the beginnings of schools in medicine and engineering. The man was an absolute genius. It just cannot be stressed enough how much he did. That doesn't mean that the other ones that were around, like Bernini or the other three, like Raphael, Donatello, that they weren't as good. It's just that Da Vinci was good at everything, which was so rare. And if you think about it today, it's still rare. Not everybody's good at everything. So for me, my favorite has always been Da Vinci, always will be. But the other three, you've got Donatello, who was a sculptor, probably one of the most famous ones, because of the fact that he sculpted in bronze and in stone, and bronze was still, making a metal sculpture was still relatively new because it was so difficult because of the amount of detail that he used. Almost all of his painting, or excuse me, his sculpting was of biblical scenes or figures. His David is his most famous. Now, his David is not what we would call the David. When people think of the David, they're thinking of Michelangelo. Donatello's David is more boy-like. And we'll get to that in a second and we'll show you why it's so famous. Then you have Raphael, who was the Madonna painter. Now, if you're always thinking he painted Madonna, the singer, no, Madonna wasn't alive. Madonna is a term that also refers to the Virgin Mary, commonly used in the Renaissance time period. You had the Madonna, and there would be a title after it. So the Madonna of, our sorrows, the Madonna of our lake of perpetuity, things like that. Raphael was an architecture, but his paintings of the Madonna were what made him famous because they were commissioned by the church. And then you have probably the one who comes closest to being like Da Vinci, and that's Michelangelo. Michelangelo was, to say he was controlling is an understatement. Okay, imagine you are commissioned by the church to paint the ceiling, and you are in your 50s, and you're going, okay, great, I can do it. And if you're me, I'm going to hire people. I'm too old to be on my back, up looking at the ceiling, painting for hours upon hours upon hours. Not Michelangelo. He painted that. Okay, he had so much control over what he did that when you go and look at the Sistine Chapel, that's him. It's not him and students. Okay, so his most famous is the Sistine Chapel, and it's his David, which is the more famous sculpture of David. It's huge, 17 feet tall. It's got a lot of rich history behind it that we'll get to in a minute and I'll tell you about. But these four, the Italian masters, these are the four that I would say are the big ones. You have others like Bernini, who I've mentioned before, who was a sculptor as well, his fountains. You've got Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi is famous for the dome in Florence, which was the first one built since the Roman Empire had crashed. So very famous man as well. I would say the reason they're not as famous as these four simply has to do with that building something wasn't considered to be as difficult as painting was. Because when you have colors like blue, which doesn't naturally occur in nature except for very few instances, where normally you'd have to grind up a stone, mix the stone with the regular paint to get the pigment, or purple, which again doesn't really occur in nature in a very vibrant purple that we associate with royalty. If you can make those colors and you can make big paintings with those colors, you are a master and you deserve that title. So let's look at our first master. We got Da Vinci. So Da Vinci, I've seen the Mona Lisa in person. It's not that big. A lot of people think it's absolutely huge. I mean, if you look at this right here, it looks big. I would say the Mona Lisa is probably a little bit bigger than this, okay, in size. Probably about 2 times the size of this. So it's not that big, maybe that big behind me. Because, again, this was a private commission. So why would I paint something that big that's going to be hung in somebody's home, okay? Now there's a lot of enigma behind the person who is the Mona Lisa. There's some theories that, there's a painting underneath and then there's a drawing underneath. Is she following you with her eyes when you move? Her smile, is it a smile? Is it more of just a resting look? But with this painting, we see individualism. We see secularism. Okay, there's no church symbols in this painting. There's nothing, no angels, there's no Christ, there's no Madonna. It is just the Mona Lisa. And so that's why it's also individualism as well, because it's focusing on her and the mystery that is her. You have that depth in the background so that you can see, it's like the road back here. You've got the bridge back here in a medieval painting. All of that would have been in the foreground together, and it would have looked very odd because it all would have been the same size. So with the Mona Lisa, that's where we see in humanism, individualism, and secularism, the depth perspective, things like that. The reason, though, why Da Vinci is given that title of the Renaissance man is more having to do with things like he did here in the middle. His flying machine. 300, almost 500 years, 400 or 500 years before the Wright brothers, he invented the idea of flight. He tried to create the first flying machine. Now, he himself never saw flight, never did it, never was able to, but the idea of it, he did it. He put it to paper. He wrote it down. He created it. His anatomy drawings on the left, you have the most famous one, the Vitruvian Man. Absolutely famous because, again, it shows you proportionality. And this specifically, that's what it was for. Okay, I don't know if you can see all the little lines, but like here on the arm, you have the forearm and these two lines. Well, that's because he's trying to show that the forearm should only be a certain length because of the proportionality to the upper arm here where the bicep and the tricep is. You've got what we would call the arm span. The arm span should match. It shouldn't be way longer than it would be versus the body. And when you look at the legs, the musculature of the legs, you've got these outlines of muscles, the calf muscle here. These were all very new things, very, very detailed that medieval art just didn't do. Now, we've already seen two pictures. Normally in my class, I just say, get over it, move on. But this was a new thing for Renaissance people to paint nude or draw nude, okay? The medieval time period would not have done that. They were very much clothing up to the neck, arms and clothing down to the wrists and all the way down to the ankles. They would not have shown the body in its natural state. But that there again goes along with the ideals of humanism, individualism, and secularism that the Renaissance really believed in. That there's nothing wrong with the human form. We should show it in its perfection. Because who created it? Well, God created it. And all things God creates are perfect. So there's nothing wrong with showing it in the natural form with no clothing. It should be shown so that you can see that man or woman can do things and see the movement of muscles, the movement of joints and arms and wrists and things like that. So it is something you see in a lot of Renaissance art. I do tell my students, just get over it, move on, it's okay. It's not there as an image to do anything other than to show the perfection of the human body. And the reason I bring that up is because Donatello and his David. Now, right here on the right-hand side, that is his sculpture of David from the Bible. Now, when I said earlier this use of something called Contrapposto, this is it right here. Notice that the arm here and leg here, relatively straight, and then the arm here and the leg here are bent. If you were to draw a line through the sculpture, the two sides would be separate. They'd be counterposed. That's what contrapposto means. Now, this David, the reason why this David is so famous is for two reasons, maybe three. The first is it was commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici. The Medici family was one of the most powerful families, not just in Italy, but in all of Europe, because of their banks. Second, the age of the model that was used. This David does not look to be very old. Maybe at the most, theories are around 12, 14 years old. We know that when David met Goliath, based off biblical scholars, he was older than that. And so would it really match with what the Bible says? But also the third reason is that the theory is this could also be Donatello himself as a younger person. There's no proof to any of these other than that it was commissioned by Medici. But this sculpture of David is his most famous because it was commissioned by the Medici family. In the middle here, you've got St. George. St. George is most famous for killing the dragon. And again, you see the contrapposto of the bent arm, bent knee, straight arm, straight leg behind the shield, the detail in the face. Even though this is bronze, the detail in the hair and the face is phenomenal. The folds of the clothing look natural. That's why Donatello is a master. It's why he ranks up there with everybody else, like Da Vinci. And then you have this marble statue here on the left that, again, it's stone, but the folds look natural, the detail in the face, the scowl, the hair, the curls, and the beard length, and the waves in the beard. All of these things are what make him a master. And if it would ever come up, they might ask you, on the AP test for an SAQ, I would say. Nothing else more than an SAQ. Give an example of humanism, give an example of individualism, give an example of secularism. Even the one that's David and St. George, even though they are religious, they still show secularism for two reasons. One, they're focusing on the human themselves and their body. That's secular. Two, there's no symbols of faith. Okay, the only way we know that that's David and that's St. George is because he called them David and St. George. So we're seeing that individualism, that secularism, because of that display of such high tension detail on that one person. And then it's humanism because this is David before he faces Goliath. Man at his greatest, bringing down his worst enemy. St. George, as he's about to go fight the dragon. The mythical dragon that always steals women and princesses and is going to destroy the town with his fiery breath. You'll have to forgive me. I don't remember who it is on the left, even though I put this together. It's only noon here, 12:30, and so I just woke up about 2 hours ago. So I apologize. I will look it up, then I will let you know. So our next master, Raphael. So Raphael is known for his paintings of the Madonna, and I put 3 examples here of the Madonna. None of them are the same. They all are different Madonnas. Okay, and the reason I did that is because I wanted you to be able to see why he was called the Madonna painter. So for Raphael, you've got Madonna in the meadow, which is this one here on the right. And that's her with Jesus, possibly an angel, maybe one of Jesus's playmates that we don't really know. Then you have the Madonna that's known as the Pala Ansidei, which is right here on the far left. So you have Madonna, you have Jesus, you have the Pope. And my guess here on the purse figure on the far left, that would be Jesus as an adult, or possibly Jesus's father, Joseph. I'm not exactly sure. You'll have to forgive me. And then his other Madonna right here in the middle, this is just focusing on her and a baby Jesus. But again, notice that they're not the same. None of these 3 all look alike. All of the women that are used have separate, distinct features. Their hair color, might be blonde. The way their hair color is sitting, the way the light is reflecting on the hair, it's different. The babies, yes, all the babies are naked, so maybe we can say there's similar there, but they're in different poses. They're different facial expressions. You have close up versus farther away. So this is more Renaissance than people at first glance give it credit for. But more importantly, again, all religious art still secular in nature because they're focusing on that individual nature of the woman. They're not focusing on her divinity. And then this painting here, the third one from the left, this is a marriage painting. This reason I put this here is to show you depth perception and perspective. Raphael was a master at being able to show this. And you see that tiny little door or window down there. But in these people, and each of these people in the back, they have individual faces. And then these people in the front, they have individual faces. That's what makes it different from Renaissance art. It's what makes him a master, because he was able to paint the detail of it. And then you have Michelangelo, probably after Da Vinci, the most famous. And that's because of the Sistine Chapel, the top picture, which took him years to paint. It is absolutely beautiful. If you ever get the chance to go to Italy, I highly recommend you make the time to stand in line to go see the Sistine Chapel. But what's really amazing to me is there is a mistake in the Sistine Chapel. Okay, and the mistake is that when you start on one end, you go to the other. Michelangelo didn't remember he was painting a massive canvas on the ceiling. He thought he was painting a smaller canvas. So when you walk in and you look up, the first panel isn't filled like the rest of them. It's not all painted because he made the mistake of not remembering perspective. and he fixes it as he goes along. But that's kind of really, we think of these people as being so perfect, they still make mistakes. But that's humanism. How did he fix it? He made it better as he went along. He made himself better. He made his work better. That's the humanist thought. This is his David sculpture. That's what we often call the David. Probably the most famous depiction of David from the Bible from any artist that I know of. It's got a very storied history because it is naked, obviously, and at the time it was created, no problems. But times changed and people became more conservative, and it was considered to be in poor taste to show a saint, a major figure from the Bible, naked. So there was a piece created to put in front of it, which then that created a backlash later on with people going, you destroyed the master's work, you destroyed this great sculpture, it needs to be seen in all of its glory. I mean, you find people today who go and see the David, and the first thing they say is, nope, shouldn't be seen. It's up to personal interpretation. For me personally, what I think is amazing is you can see the outline of his muscles here in his chest and his stomach, as well as in his arms, the veins in his hand. Michelangelo, I could only hope to have 1/10 of his talent, and I don't even have 100th of his talent. Okay, that's why he's a master here, because he could do in stone what people can't do in real life in depicting themselves. They can't show themselves. And he was able to do it in stone, On the right-hand side here, you've got another Madonna and Christ. This was a commissioned piece from the church. But again, you have the facial features, the distinct facial features, distinct hair features, the folds of the cloth and the Madonna all look natural with how it would fall. So that's why we see these four often called the masters, because they truly, truly are. And without them, I'm sure Renaissance art would have developed and probably developed in a much organic way as it did initially. But I don't know if it would have developed in the way we see with the human form and the depiction of the human form. It just can't be said enough that focus on the human, that focus on the self, is what sets Renaissance art apart from other art styles. So, who's going to pay for this? Because let me tell you, that marble that David's made of, that's not cheap marble. The paint, blue paint especially, and purple paint, highly expensive paints back then, because they're not very commonly occurring in nature. Browns, reds, greens, yes, yellows, yeah, but not blue and purple. That costs a lot of money. So you've got two people who are going to pay for this. On the one side, you've got the wealthy families, the rich. On the other side, you have the church. The church is going to do this for two distinct reasons. Okay, one, it shows power. The church was the most powerful political organization on the planet at that time. They had more money than any of the other kings in Europe. They had more money than most of the other organizations in Europe. They were the binding glue to what it meant to be European. And one of the ways that they kept that glue together was through their displays of power. Because in a medieval pyramid, when you're talking about feudalism, the king's not at the top. The pope is at the top. The king answers to the pope. And if the pope wants to, the pope literally holds your earthly life and your immortal life in his hands. Because he could say, I'm excommunicating you. Well, you're never getting into heaven. And if you're excommunicated, now that means anybody can kill you because you have no protection. So he's got both in his hands. So art showcases that power. It showcases wealth. Also, art is a tool that showcases cultural ideals. All right. In 1492, not just Columbus sailing the ocean blue, we also have the beginnings of the Inquisition. Now, the Reformation hadn't started just yet, but at the height of the Reformation, the Inquisition and the art that the church commissioned were to display the power and the reach of the church, as well as to try to bring people back into the fold of the Catholic Church instead of going to the Protestant church. So the church really uses art as a message. We're powerful, we're rich, We hold everything you hold dear in our hands. Don't mess with us. That's not to say, though, that the church is always going to remain that powerful. With the rise of the wealthy families, things are going to change radically for the church very quickly. And so this rise in wealth, though, it happens because of the Black Death. You have a lot of people who die, an estimated third of Europe dies. So if you've got a town with 10 blacksmiths and only one blacksmith survives, that blacksmith can charge whatever he wants when he's doing a job, which means that he can go from being a blacksmith in 1 year to being a wealthy financier 10 years down the road. And that's the beginnings of what we call the middle class today. It's disposable income. You've got enough to pay your bills, you've got enough to put food on the table and a roof over your head, and you've got a little bit extra to buy things that you don't really need, but you kind of want, okay? In Italian, they called this the popolo grasso, or the fat people, or the fat population, because at that time frame, fat was two things. It meant you had a lot of food, but you had the money to buy the food, okay? So if you were wealthy, you tended to be more plump, more fat, and one of the ways you showed off that, besides the food you ate, was the art you commissioned. Earlier, we looked at the David that Donatello made, commissioned by the Medici family. Why did the Medici family commission it? Because they could. Because they could afford to. They could afford to waste their money on a bronze statue that they didn't need. And it showed that they had money and power. Two of the most famous people at the time, beginnings of the Renaissance, you have Jacob Fugger, who was a German financier who would patronize art as well as paintings of himself and his family. And then Cosimo de' Medici was the beginning of the Medici dynasty of Florence, and the one who takes it to its greatest height and begins the spread of the Medici banking system around Europe. And he displayed his power through the art that he bought. And also, art was considered to be a gift to the lower classes. Because if you see all of these people amassing money that they don't need, amassing art that they don't need, it's going to breed resentment. It's going to breed hatred. Well, what's one way to prevent that? I, as a wealthy person, I am not making this art for myself. I'm going to give it to you, the townspeople. I'm going to make sure that you are able to enjoy this every day as you walk through the square, the piazza in Venice or in Florence or in Milan, places like that. It was a really big way for people to show their power. And art, even to this day, still does that. Okay, think about people who go into homes and you see art, we have categories of art, Target art, right? Walmart art. And then you've got art from places like Michael's or higher end places. Then going to art galleries and art dealers and then specific artists. I will never own a Picasso in my life probably because I can't afford it. And I'm okay with that. But when I see somebody who owns a Picasso, I know that they've got money because they can afford it. And that shows power. And that's what art does. So it's pretty quick overview into Renaissance art. It's not like they're going to be asking you a million questions about Renaissance art. The reason why I did this, I really wanted you guys to understand that the Renaissance isn't just the rebirth that we often term it to mean. It's a complete change in the viewpoint of Europe. It's a complete change in how Europe is going to show itself off to the world. And art is a really good way to look at that. Art can give us so much insight into what a culture believes are its values, or believes what's right and wrong, and can tell us why they do what they do. And when we look at the masters, we can see the art that they create is to glorify man. Yes, God is the reason that they're doing it because the church is paying for it, but they're doing it by showing mankind, not focusing on God himself as much like they did in the medieval time period. So that's about what I was going to cover today. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them up in the chat. You can download this presentation. It is linked to the Fiveable website so that you can have this with you. The crowdcast will be put up for you here in a few minutes so that you can go back and watch it later on. But I hope you enjoyed it. Please do come back on Tuesday for Stephen Kuklik to go over the actual Renaissance itself, not just the art. He's going to go over into the more nitty-gritty details. And I will see you guys on next Saturday for me. It'll be Friday for you. So, Namihi, you guys have a great day, and I will see you guys later. Thank you.